When you're sailing upwind on a beat, the goal is to make very smooth tacks, because you can't sail directly into the wind. That's called the no-go zone. So you must come at the wind at an angle, and then you make your way forward by tacking back and forth across the wind. The one at the helm starts the process by alerting the crew that there's going to be a change in direction, and then on signal, he or she slowly but steadily moves the tiller from one direction into the other. And as you do this, the crew releases the sheets, that's the ropes, on the sails from one side of the boat, and then they reattach them on the other. And if you do this perfectly, correctly, you won't spill any of the drinks you might have been sipping. But there are times when things happen and a tack is in order. Perhaps you didn't see a boat and you don't have the right of way. Or maybe you do have the right of way but not see you. Or maybe you're approaching a shoal or some kind of obstruction. One at the helm must act quickly. The tiller gets pushed hard to the other side while you yell out for everyone to watch out, because soon that boom comes swinging across the boat. It's also not good on the equipment, which takes a beating on that kind of turns like that. Things can break. But in an emergency, sometimes it's necessary. Now today, as we move into the last 4 chapters of 2 Corinthians, we witness Paul making an abrupt tack. We have seen Paul tack back and forth between various topics throughout this letter. In the previous chapter we saw 2 weeks ago, he discussed the offering for the saints in Jerusalem. And he ended that section on a high note, this beautiful passage, thanking God for this incredible gift. Then in the 10th chapter, Paul takes a different direction. Much of the first 7 chapters of Paul's ministry. Then comes that appeal to that offering to help those in Jerusalem. And now in the 10th chapter, Paul goes on offense. Let's hear the word of the Lord as I read the entirety of the 10th chapter of 2 Corinthians. I myself, Paul, appeal to you by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold towards you when I'm away. I ask that when I am present, I need not show boldness by daring to oppose those who think we are acting according to human standards. Indeed, we live as humans, but do not wage war according to human standards. For the weapons of our warfare are not merely human, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. We are ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. Look at what is before your eyes. If you're confident that you belong to Christ, remind yourself of this, that just as you belong to Christ, so also do we. Now, even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up, and not for tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem as though I am trying to frighten you with my letters. For someone says his letters are weighty and strong, but his body presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Let such a person understand that what we say by the letter when absent, we will also do when present. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves. But when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they do not show good sense. We, however, will not boast beyond limits, but will keep within the field that God has assigned to us, to reach out even as far as you. For we were not overstepping our limits when we reached you. We were the first to come all the way to you with the good news of Christ. We do not boast beyond limits. That is the labor of others. But our hope is that as your faith increases, our field among you may be greatly enlarged, so that we may proclaim the good news in lands beyond you, without boasting of the work already done in someone else's field. Let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. For it is not those who commend themselves that are approved, but those whom the Lord commends. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As I have said repeatedly through our work for 2 Corinthians, we're only listening in on one side of the conversation. This forces us to make conjectures as to what as I'll have to do this morning. While this is a handicap for modern readers, this letter still is a treasure because this letter gives us this very personal look into the life of Paul. So what do we learn about Paul in this chapter? Verse 10 summarizes a lot. Paul can write elegant and bold letters, but in person, he is meek, and he's not much to look at. Some thought him to be weak. Now, we don't know if Paul has always been this way, but certainly after all the beatings that he endured, we can assume that physically he was no longer in the best of shape. They also complain about his speech. Did Paul stutter? Did he have an accent that was hard to understand? Many of you can probably recall Paul complaining about the thorn that he has in his side. We'll actually get to that in a few weeks because that comes up in chapter 12 of this letter. If we take references in the letters to Acts, in the letters and in Acts together, we're left with a picture of Paul that's not exactly an example of strength and health, but he is an example of one, as he wrote to the Corinthians in his first letter, one whom God has chosen that is weak, that makes shame of those that are strong. Strive to follow Christ, we should also see Paul as an example for us. The greatest missionary in the history of the church faced multiple obstacles. Paul's struggles should inspire us to remain faithful and to continue to do the Lord's work even when we are overwhelmed. It is interesting, Paul, who was physically weak, challenges us to run our race with our eyes on the prize, on the goal. Often those who struggle most in life become the cheerleaders of others. And Paul cheers on those who are following Christ. And we need to cheer on one another, encourage one another. And even if we can't do anything else, think about what it is we can do. Perhaps just dropping a note to someone hurting, or picking up the phone and making a call to encourage someone. But there is more to this in the passage than our insight into Paul. As I have mentioned earlier, Paul makes this drastic shift between the 9th and 10th chapters. 2 weeks ago, we saw him being positive as he encouraged the Corinthians to participate in the larger church. But his tone changes here in the 10th chapter. Some scholars think this part of the letter must have belonged to accidentally tacked on here, but that for sure. It appears, however, that Paul at the very least set down his pen at the end of chapter 9. And when he picked his pen back up to begin writing what we know now as chapter 10, something has changed. Perhaps Paul has received some additional news from Corinth. As we've seen, Paul had been so excited to receive the news from Titus, in which he heard that things were going well in Corinth and that people loved Paul. Did someone else come in and give a countering viewpoint? Was Paul informed that folks laughed at his speech and his physical appearance while wondering how such a person could write so eloquently? We're not sure exactly what happened, but we do know that Paul is now taking a different tack. Paul goes on the offense, but he does this in a very strange way. He lifts up the meekness and the gentleness of Jesus Christ. That doesn't sound like offense, does it? To talk about the meekness of one? These days there are many people who push for a more masculine Jesus. In a book that came out a few years ago titled Jesus and John Wayne, which is by Kristen DeMintz, a professor at Calvin University, she explains that Christians have tried to make Jesus into this tough, no-nonsense type of man. They generally do this by referring to one particular story in the New Testament. That is Jesus turning the tables. There we do see Jesus' anger. But it is anger at making a mockery of God's house, of his Father's house. Yeah, everywhere else Jesus tends to be meek and he teaches things like turn the other cheek, which I admit, something I have a hard time doing. I can only thank God for grace. While we live as mortal humans, Paul says, Christ is not to wage war according to human standards. Instead of brute strength, we have to depend on God's power. Paul isn't making the case here to be a tough fighter. Instead, he shows us that strength doesn't come from having a bulky body or persuasive speech or even swords. Instead, it depends on God. Again, I find that I'm quick to counterattack when I'm wrong, but that's not something that I can be proud of. The problem with such actions is that we're living by the world's standards and not by God's. Sebastian Junger, a German, was embedded with the 173rd Airborne Brigade in the Koregan Valley of Afghanistan back in 2007 and 2008. And he wrote experiences in a book that's titled War. In that book, Junger writes about a conversation that he initiated with the soldiers of this group that he was attached to when he began to ask them about God. I mean, these are soldiers that were out there and were experiencing firefights almost every day. Some of them spoke about their prayers and about their faith. But then there was one soldier who proclaimed, he says, you know, we don't need God when we can call in the Apaches. Now, the Apaches are a type of helicopter gunship that can bring murderous fire on an enemy position. That's the macho view of life. That's not the meekness that Paul refers to. Even though he is meek and obviously not a very good talker, Paul proposes that by relying on divine power, he can destroy the strongholds of the enemy. But such power is hidden. It's like when Jesus spoke about destroying the temple and building it up again in 3 days. And everyone thought he was nuts because, you know, they've been working on that temple for decades and it still wasn't done. Of course, Jesus wasn't talking about the mortar and the blocks that went into that temple. He's talking about his own body. And his body was resurrected on the third day. Paul continues, reminding them they all belong to Christ, that everyone is to be on the same team. He addresses boasting, wanting us to use boasting only when we build up others. Do you build someone up or do you build up? Sadly, I confess, doing the latter, which is something I struggle with, and I'm pretty sure I'm not alone. Again, thanks God. Thank God for grace. It then appears Paul addresses other evangelists who have come to Corinth. Did some of them think Paul was overstepping his limits by continuing to engage with the Corinthians? We get a hint of this battle within Corinth in 1 Corinthians, where Paul speaks of others who have come after him there preaching. And Paul there in 1 Corinthians insists they're on the same team. Paul wants them to understand that he may have planted the church there. Apollos may have watered the church there. But it is God who gives the growth. And if other preachers come after Paul, Paul just wants to make sure they're following the Lord Jesus. And if they are, they're not in competition. However, if they are spreading a false gospel, then Paul is ready to challenge them. But Paul, who has boasted about the church in Corinth, is going to continue to do that. Because his goal, as we see here at the end of this chapter, is to spread the gospel as far as he can around the known world of the time. And then it's almost as if he rethinks what he has written when he suggests that if those who boast, well, they should really only boast in the Lord. After all, everyone involved is working for God, not for themselves. So what do we learn from this passage? We don't have to be pretty, handsome, or speak eloquently to be an effective disciple for Jesus. God can use us as we are. Second, our strength comes from God, not from human standards. Trust God, whose power can be revealed in our weakness. May we always give God the glory. Amen.